Could you tell me where and when it all began?
This is such a wonderful story. It's almost like a fairy tale. The original, I have to show you a picture of this guy. The original C.F. Martin the first. Check this out, Michael. When you look at this face, do you think of a guitar? No. But this is the first guy. Grew up in a small town in Germany. Was great at working with wood. His father made furniture, but he had a dream to make a guitar. And he was forced to go to Vienna to learn how to make a guitar from a guy named Johann Stauffer. Now, I don't know if you've ever seen this, Anders, but this is called the Stauffer headstock. And guitars in the 1800s looked like this. They have no resemblance to anything that we know. They were very small, about yay big. The strings came from the stomach linings of cat and sheep. And you played Baroque music in root position, so you had maybe 10 or 12 frets. And he learned how to make these things in Vienna, went back to his hometown, opened up a shop, and the Violin and Cello Guild in Germany took him to court and argued that he didn't learn in Germany.
That's hard.
Very hard. And the judge ruled in his favor. The judge saw he learned in Austria, but I think it really was a very uncomfortable feeling for him. And that's why in 1833, a date that is very proudly stamped on the headstock of a Martin guitar, he packed up his family's tools and he emigrated to my hometown, New York City, and set up a shop, a very small shop, maybe 5 times the size of this stage, and sold guitars. And so it was a one-man show. He made them, he sold some accessories, but he hated New York.
He hated New York?
Hated New York. Sort of like moving from, Vecca to Singapore. It was a tremendous cultural shift. And there was a very strong indication he would go back to Germany. And at the last minute, thankfully, he got a letter from family that lived in a small valley in Pennsylvania that looks amazingly like Germany. And in 1839, moved to this small town and really been there ever since, making guitars by hand. A shift in his thinking, however, when he went from New York to Nazareth. He wasn't going to think about selling anymore. He was just going to concentrate on manufacturing. And that's when he opened up the first small factory, which we actually used until 1964.
Wow.
Yeah, and it's still standing. It's a very cool place. But that's when the design changes began. The first design change was, of course, this crazy curly Q headstock that you can see Leo Fender also thought was a good idea in 1954 for a Strat. But the tuning gears came from Europe, and in 1840 there was no DHL and UPS, and it was impossible to get these in a regular way. So he changed to tuning gears he could get locally, which looked like the slotted headstock. I don't know, can you see this, Michael? The slotted headstock guitar has these tuning gears that are usually found on a classical guitar. So that's why the Martin guitars of the 1800s had that kind of headstock. But in 1850, this is a very critical year for the guitar. The acoustic guitar gets its sound primarily from the top. The top is the speaker cone of the instrument. The more the top vibrates, the more sound you have. So it's very critical how you brace the underside of the top. The way he learned from Stauffer in Vienna was the classical tradition of fan bracing. In 1850, for some unknown reason, he changed that bracing pattern to an X brace.
An X brace?
Yeah, he didn't patent it.
Darn it.
Darn it. Because if you look under the top of anybody's flat top steel string guitar, you'll find a copy of Martin X bracing. So we've been doing it for 160 years. We're very good at X bracing.
What's the big change? I mean, how does it change the sound?
Well, I think because it's impossible for me to know what the guitars of the early 1800s sounded like, but I have played an 1833 Martin guitar. And I think because the bodies slowly began to get bigger, that a substantial change needed to happen in the bracing pattern. Plus, classical guitars always use nylon or gut strings, we started to now see a little bit of a change. We're still using gut strings. In fact, from 1850 till the early 1920s, and this is a remarkable part of the history of the guitar, 90% of guitar players were women.
Cool.
Yeah. We would call this now, you've probably heard this before, parlor music. So we women would get together in the parlor and play these little parlor instruments and sip tea. And I often wonder, what were you guys doing? And I think the only thing I could think of, you were killing the animals for the strings.
Probably.
I can't imagine a woman taking a cat and swinging it around. Oh, let me get a set of strings out of this sucker, you know? And maybe the guitar might not have evolved to the thing it has evolved into if it stayed in the hands of women, but it wasn't meant to be. In the early 1920s in America, and this was true, of course, worldwide, if you wanted to listen to music, you had to go listen to music. There was no radio or anything recorded. And what everybody in America was interested in listening to, what they were going in droves to hear, were these roving orchestras of banjo and mandolin players.
Banjo and mandolin.
It's like the first heavy metal music, you know, it's very loud. And thankfully for us, there was one banjo player. He was sort of like the Eric Clapton of the banjo world. He wanted to play guitar with the banjo and mandolin orchestra. Good luck. Could you imagine his frustration at gut strings and the simple, delicate nature of it?
No one heard him.
No one heard him. But he recognized Martin made a good guitar, and he approached the company, still a little teeny company, and asked them if they could make him a guitar that would sound like a banjo. So now this was the real first inspiration to think about putting metal strings on a guitar. That had never been a standard. So we made a model for this guy to play with the orchestra. It had banjo strings on it. In fact, friction pegs, not, turning pegs, like a banjo. And because he wanted more frets, the prototype that sounded really good to him was where we attached the neck to the body at the 14th fret. No one had done that before on a standard guitar. We called that guitar the orchestra model. So if you've seen a Martin OM, that's what the OM stands for. This was the first 14 fret steel string guitar to be a standard in our industry.
Well, with steel strings, don't you have a problem with the tension of the lid?
Yeah. Well, we beefed up the X brace. So the X brace started to get a little thicker to compensate for the steel strings pulling up on the top. So the year that we debuted this was 1929, and that was really the first standard 14 fret steel string guitar. And it started, of course, mimicking. Many other companies copied that 14 fret neck as a result, and it started to be what everybody wanted. Now the price of this guitar when we made it in 1929 was $50 or 350 Swedish krona. Those guitars, I saw on eBay 2 years ago an orchestra model from the 1930s sold for $2.3 million.
Wow.
Yeah. Martin guitars hold their value incredibly well. People ask me, do I have old Martin guitars? I can't afford old Martin guitars, but I do have some nice new ones that I've bought, and one day they'll be old. And I love that. And anybody out there who's considering buying a Martin guitar, it's a fantastic investment, not only in your playing, but an investment.
You talked earlier about the women in the 19th century playing guitar. Some years ago, you launched a women's model, didn't you?
This was a project near and dear to my heart, Anders. I was at that time traveling, doing clinics with C.F. Martin IV, Chris Martin, and we both would often speak of the lack of women at the clinics, and I think it was clear that perhaps dreadnoughts may be
dreadnoughts
uncomfortable for I'll get to that's part of the next
Okay.
part of the history. But we wanted to design an ergonomic guitar for small-bodied people, like women. That guitar was a great success, fantastic success. And I was very happy to be part of a group at Martin Guitar. I would drive there once a month, and the group designed a fantastic guitar called, it was a double O, but as deep as a dreadnought. And it had a slotted headstock. It was loud, delicate, had a fantastic sound, and we did very well with that model. Getting back to the history.
Thank you.
So there we were in 1929 with the orchestra model, $50. And at the end of that year, of course, was the Great Depression. Nobody had $50 to buy a guitar. And this was a very challenging time for the company. Actually, during this time, we made more of these things.
Cute little ones.
Yes. The ukulele, by the way, the translation for the ukulele is dancing flea. The happiness of the dancing flea. It's a.
Yeah, why do you always get so happy when you hear?
It really does. Maybe it's the lack of minor chords. Even a minor chord sounds kind of happy on it.
Yeah, it does.
I think it's the register and the. You can. Yeah, it is a happy instrument. This was a challenging time for the company, and during this time of the Depression was the rise of a new kind of music, Anders. This was country, bluegrass, Appalachian folk, telling their hard luck stories, singing in huge halls, no microphones, no PAs. They weren't invented yet. They had the strength of the voice and the guitar. And clearly the orchestra model, as balanced as it was, wasn't loud enough. So the country musicians asked the Martin Company to make them a loud guitar. And this was another fantastic opportunity. So the company designed a bass guitar for these guys, 14 fret, steel string. And since
Acoustic.
since it was the biggest guitar we ever made, they gave it a special name. They named it after the biggest class of British battleships used in World War I.
Dreadnoughts.
Certainly. One of the most copied acoustic guitar shapes in the world, if not the most copied acoustic.
The definition of a guitar.
The definition of the Western guitar. And I think Martin can feel very proud about that. But 1931, we came to market with this guitar, and it really became the turning point of a small family business becoming a world-renowned product. Because what happened was the soldiers came back, started playing country music after World War II. Then you had people like Hank Williams, the Kingston Trio, the Lettermen. They were all playing Martin guitars. And then the 60s hit. And you had Bob Dylan and Joni Mitchell, Neil Young, Crosby, Stills and Nash, Gordon Lightfoot, Johnny Cash. Everybody was playing Martin guitars. And that was when we had to build a new factory in 1964.